What happens when one of hip-hop's most legendary figures gets pushed too far by a talk show host who thinks he can disrespect anyone for a cheap laugh? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had Snoop Dogg walking off Jimmy Kimmel's set in absolute fury, leaving the audience stunned and the host scrambling to save face. This wasn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This was a calculated attempt to humiliate a cultural icon that backfired spectacularly. The tension in that studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and what you're about to hear will shock you. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this one is going to blow your mind. The evening started like any other taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The studio audience was buzzing with excitement, knowing that Calvin Cortazar Broadus Jr., better known to the world as Snoop Dogg, was scheduled to appear. For most hosts, having Snoop on the show would be considered a privilege, an opportunity to sit down with someone who had not only revolutionized music, but had become a beloved cultural figure spanning generations. His laid-back demeanor and natural charisma had made him a favorite guest on talk shows for decades. But Jimmy Kimmel had something different planned for this interview. Behind the scenes, Kimmel had been working with his writing team on what he called gotcha moments, those controversial segments designed to create viral clips rather than meaningful conversation. The host had grown increasingly desperate for attention, grabbing content as his ratings had been slipping against his late-night competitors. His writers had prepared a series of what they considered hard-hitting questions, but anyone with common sense could see they were nothing more than cheap shots designed to embarrass the guest. When Snoop arrived at the studio, he was in great spirits. He had always been professional in his media appearances, understanding that these interviews were part of the business. He greeted the production staff warmly, took photos with crew members, and even spent time talking with some of the younger employees about their career aspirations. This was vintage Snoop, always willing to lift others up and share his wisdom with the next generation. The makeup artist later recalled how relaxed and funny Snoop was during prep, telling stories about his grandchildren and his latest business ventures. He seemed genuinely excited to be there, mentioning how he had been looking forward to the interview because he had some important projects he wanted to discuss. Little did he know that Kimmel had no intention of letting him promote anything positive. As showtime approached, Kimmel was backstage going over his notes one final time. His producers had briefed him on the approach they wanted him to take, emphasizing that they needed moments that would trend on social media. The host seemed almost giddy with anticipation, apparently unaware that he was about to make one of the biggest mistakes of his career. The show's opening went as planned, with Kimmel delivering his monologue to the usual mix of applause and laughter from the studio audience. But those who knew him well noticed something different in his demeanor that night. There was an edge to his humor, a meanness that suggested he was building up to something. When he finally introduced Snoop Dogg, the audience erupted in genuine excitement and appreciation. Snoop walked out with his characteristic smooth stride, wearing a sharp suit and his signature calm smile. The crowd's enthusiasm was infectious, with people standing and cheering for nearly 30 seconds. It was clear that this man was beloved, respected, and admired by people from all walks of life. As he settled into the guest chair, Snoop seemed ready for what he assumed would be a typical late-night chat about music, family, and his various business endeavors. The first few minutes of the interview proceeded normally, with Kimmel asking standard questions about Snoop's recent projects and upcoming tours. Snoop answered with his usual charm and wit, getting genuine laughs from the audience with his storytelling ability and natural timing. The chemistry seemed fine on the surface, but careful observers might have noticed that Kimmel seemed impatient, as if he was just going through the motions before getting to what he really wanted to discuss. Then, without warning, Kimmel shifted gears completely. His tone became more aggressive, his questions more pointed, and his entire demeanor changed from that of a friendly host to something resembling a prosecutor. The audience sensed the change immediately, with the laughter dying down and an uncomfortable tension filling the studio. The shift in Kimmel's approach was jarring and immediate. Without any smooth transition or warning, he leaned forward in his chair with a smirk that made everyone in the studio uncomfortable. His first real blow came disguised as a question about Snoop's past, but it was delivered with a tone that suggested he was trying to embarrass rather than inform. So, Calvin, Kimmel began, deliberately using Snoop's real name in a way that felt condescending. Let's talk about your legal troubles from back in the day. I mean, you've had quite a few run-ins with the law, haven't you? Our audience probably wants to know about all those arrests and court cases that followed you around for years. The audience immediately felt the discomfort. This wasn't the playful banter they had come to expect from late-night television. Snoop's expression didn't change much, but those who knew him could see the slight tightening around his eyes. He had been asked about his past before, but never with such obvious, malicious intent. "Well, Jimmy," Snoop replied calmly, "I think most people know that I've been open about my journey. I've talked about learning from mistakes and growing as a person. That's what life is about, learning and evolving." But Kimmel wasn't satisfied with that response. Instead of moving on to another topic or acknowledging Snoop's growth, he doubled down with an even more pointed attack. "But didn't you glorify violence and drug dealing in your music? I mean, you made millions of dollars, essentially promoting criminal behavior to young people. How do you square that with being a role model now?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several audience members could be heard shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't journalism or entertainment. This was a calculated attempt to paint one of hip-hop's most respected figures as a hypocrite and a bad influence. Snoop's response was measured but firm. "Jimmy, hip-hop has always been about telling stories from the streets, about real experiences. Artists like myself have always used our platforms to show both the struggles and the consequences. If you actually listen to my music over the, years, you'd hear messages about family, about building community, about learning from your mistakes." The host's response revealed his true intentions. Instead of engaging with Snoop's thoughtful answer, Kimmel let out a dismissive laugh and shook his head as if he didn't buy any of it. "Come on, that sounds like something your publicist would say. Let's be honest here, you got rich off of promoting a dangerous lifestyle." The disrespect was now unmistakable. Snoop's jaw tightened slightly, and his voice took on a different tone. When he responded, "Jimmy, I think you're misunderstanding what hip-hop culture is about. We've always been storytellers, and our stories reflect the reality of our communities. I've spent decades giving back, mentoring young people, and using my platform to create positive change." But Kimmel was far from finished. His next attack was even more personal and showed just how far he was willing to go for his viral moment. "Speaking of young people, what about your own family? I mean, you've got kids and grandkids now. Are you comfortable with them listening to some of the things you've said in your songs? Some of the language you've used about women, for example?" The question was delivered with such smugness that several people in the audience actually gasped. Snoop's family had always been off-limits in interviews, and bringing up his children and grandchildren in this context was crossing a line that any decent host would never approach. Snoop's response was controlled, but clearly strained. "My family is not up for discussion here, Jimmy. If you want to talk about my music or my career, that's fine. But my children and grandchildren are not part of this conversation." Instead of respecting that boundary, Kimmel pressed even harder. "But isn't it relevant? I mean, you're sitting here talking about being a role model, but you've made songs that are explicitly about violence and drugs. Don't you think parents have a right to know about the kind of influence you might be having on their kids?" The audience was now clearly uncomfortable. What had started as excited anticipation for a fun interview with a beloved celebrity had turned into something that felt more like an ambush. Several people in the front rows were shaking their heads, obviously disagreeing with the host's approach. Snoop leaned back in his chair, his famous calm demeanor still intact, but with an underlying tension that anyone paying attention could feel. Jimmy, I've been in this business for over 30 years. I've seen hosts who know how to have a conversation, and hosts who just want to create drama. Which one are you trying to be tonight? The question was delivered with such quiet dignity that it made Kimmel's behavior look even worse by comparison. A good host would have taken this as an opportunity to reset the interview and move in a more positive direction. Instead, Kimmel seemed to take it as a challenge. I'm trying to be the kind of host who asks real questions instead of just letting celebrities come on and promote their projects without any accountability. Kimmel shot back. I think our audience deserves more than just a puff-piece interview. The word accountability seemed to strike a nerve with Snoop. His posture straightened, and for the first time in the interview, his famous laid-back persona showed cracks. Accountability, Jimmy, I've been accountable my whole career. I've been honest about my past, I've taken responsibility for my mistakes, and I've worked to make positive changes in my community. What exactly are you trying to hold me accountable for? Kimmel's response showed just how deep his disrespect ran. Well, for starters, the fact that you've made a career out of promoting criminal behavior, and now you want to be seen as some kind of elder statesman. It just seems a little convenient, doesn't it? The accusation was so unfair and so obviously designed to provoke that several audience members actually booed. Snoop had spent decades building bridges, working with young people, and using his platform to promote positive messages. To reduce his entire career to promoting criminal behavior was not just inaccurate, it was insulting. Snoop's response was still controlled, but there was steel in his voice now. Jimmy, you clearly don't understand hip-hop culture or what I've been about throughout my career. But more importantly, you don't seem to understand how to treat a guest with basic respect. The host's next move was perhaps his biggest mistake of the night. Instead of acknowledging that he had crossed a line, he decided to escalate even further. Respect? I think respect is something that has to be earned, and I'm not sure glorifying gang culture and drug dealing is the way to earn it. The words hung in the air like a slap across the face. This wasn't just an unfair characterization of Snoop's career. It was a direct insult to everything he had built and accomplished. The audience's reaction was immediate and negative, with boos and negative comments clearly audible throughout the studio. The moment those words left Kimmel's mouth, the entire atmosphere in the studio changed. What had been uncomfortable tension suddenly became electric with anger and disbelief. Snoop Dogg, who had remained remarkably composed despite the relentless disrespect, finally reached his breaking point. Hold up, Snoop said, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. He held up his hand and leaned forward in his chair, his famous calm demeanor completely gone. Jimmy, you got me completely messed up if you think you're going to sit here and disrespect me like this on national television. The audience fell completely silent. This wasn't the laid-back Snoop they knew from decades of interviews and appearances. This was a man who had been pushed too far by someone who clearly didn't understand the magnitude of what he was dealing with. Kimmel, apparently oblivious to the fact that he had crossed every possible line, tried to maintain his smug attitude. I'm not disrespecting you. I'm just asking the questions that need to be asked. Isn't that what journalism is about? Snoop's laugh was cold and humorless. Journalism? Jimmy, you wouldn't know journalism if it walked up and introduced itself to you. What you're doing right now is trying to ambush me for some cheap viral moment, and I'm not having it. The host's response showed just how tone-deaf he truly was. Look, If you can't handle tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. This is how the real world works. That comment was the final straw. Snoop stood up from his chair so quickly that it made several people in the front row flinch. His voice rose for the first time in the entire interview, and the power behind it filled every corner of the studio. The real world. Jimmy, let me tell you about the real world. The real world is where I came from nothing and built an empire. The real world is where I've employed thousands of people, mentored countless young artists, and given back to my community in ways you could never understand. The real world is where I've earned the respect of my peers, my fans, and my family through decades of hard work and authenticity. Kimmel tried to interrupt, but Snoop wasn't finished. No, you wanted to have this conversation, so we're going to have it. You sit here in your comfortable studio, making jokes about other people's lives, thinking you can tear down someone like me for entertainment. But you don't know anything about struggle, about building something from nothing, about taking responsibility for your community. The audience was completely captivated. Many were nodding in agreement, clearly siding with Snoop against their host. The power and authenticity of his words stood in stark contrast to Kimmel's petty provocations. You want to talk about accountability? Snoop continued, his voice now booming through the studio. Let's talk about your accountability. What have you built besides a career making fun of other people? What communities have you uplifted? What young people have you mentored? What positive change have you created in this world? Kimmel's face had gone pale. He was clearly unprepared for this level of pushback and seemed to realize for the first time that his cheap ambush tactics had backfired spectacularly. Now wait just a minute, he stammered. I think you're overreacting here. Overreacting? Snoop's voice was incredulous. Jimmy, you brought up my family. You disrespected my career. You tried to paint me as some kind of criminal, and now you want to tell me I'm overreacting. You must have lost your damn mind. The host tried one last, desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Look, this is my show, and I ask the questions I think are important. If you don't like it, that's your problem. That comment sealed his fate. Snoop looked at him with such contempt that several people in the audience actually gasped. Your show? Jimmy, this might be your show, but I'm not your employee. I'm not your puppet. And I damn sure don't have to sit here and let you disrespect me for your little ratings grab. He began moving toward the edge of the interview area, clearly preparing to leave. You know what your problem is, Jimmy. You think because you have a television show, you can treat people however you want. You think you can tear down someone, like me, to make yourself look important. But all you've done tonight is show everyone exactly who you really are. Kimmel, now clearly panicking as he watched his interview completely fall apart, tried to salvage the situation. Come on, Snoop. Don't be like this. It's just television. We're just having a conversation. Snoop stopped and turned back to face him, his expression a mixture of disgust and pity. Just television? Jimmy, this is people's lives you're playing with. This is respect you're throwing away for cheap laughs. And this conversation? This conversation is over. He started walking toward the backstage area, but then stopped one more time to address the audience directly. To all the beautiful people in this audience, I want you to know that this is not what I expected when I came here tonight. I came here to talk about my music, my family, my businesses, and the positive things happening in my life. Instead, I was ambushed by someone who clearly has no understanding of respect or professionalism. The audience began applauding, many of them standing to show their support for Snoop and their disapproval of how he had been treated. The sound filled the studio, a clear indication of where their sympathies lay. I've been doing interviews for over 30 years, Snoop continued, and I've never been treated with such disrespect by a host. This man doesn't represent the kind of journalism or entertainment that lifts people up. He represents the worst kind of media, the kind that tears people down for ratings. Kimmel made one final desperate attempt to stop the disaster unfolding before him. Snoop, please, let's just finish the interview. I'm sure we can find some common ground here. Snoop looked at him with complete disdain. Common ground? Jimmy, the only common ground we have is this studio floor, and I'm about to leave that behind too. You had your chance to conduct yourself with professionalism and respect, and you chose to embarrass yourself instead. He turned to the audience one last time. Y'all deserve better than this. You deserve hosts who treat their guests with dignity, who ask real questions instead of trying to create fake drama, and who understand that entertainment should lift people up, not tear them down. With that, Snoop Dogg walked off the set of Jimmy Kimmel Live, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a panicked host, and a moment that would be talked about for years to come. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the suddenly quiet studio as Kimmel sat alone at his desk, realizing that his attempt to create a viral moment had succeeded, but not in the way he had intended. The audience continued applauding as Snoop disappeared backstage, their message clear. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a moment when manufactured drama met authentic dignity, and dignity won. Kimmel was left to face the uncomfortable reality that his disrespectful behavior had been exposed on his own show, in front of his own audience, and there was no way to spin it into anything other than what it was: a complete and total failure of professional conduct. That's the story of how one of hip-hop's most respected figures refused to be disrespected for cheap entertainment, and how a talk show host learned the hard way that some people cannot and will not be pushed around for ratings. Make sure to subscribe to hear more incredible stories like this one, and comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Snoop Dogg was right to walk off? Or should he have stayed and continued the interview?